Hi, friends. Welcome to this latest episode of the Nationalist View, and we have with us a very, very special guest today, Mr. Sam Barron. Sam, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me, Arun.
Yeah, Sam is joining us from United States of America. He's a policy analyst, researcher, and consultant with expertise at intersection of human rights and trade policy. And Sam is also a specialist in Southeast Asian politics and foreign policy. His research and commentary on political and economic developments across the ASEAN region have been featured in or cited by academics, think tanks, media outlets, including Cambridge University Press, Foreign Policy, South China Morning Post, Nikkei Asia, the ICEAS Yusuf Ishaq Institute, and the International Institute of Strategic Studies, among others. And Sam is also a policy research fellow with the Yokosuka Council on Asia Pacific Studies. And we're going to talk more about basically Japan, Southeast Asia, and India. And we are going to break down the latest developments which are happening there, also the long term implications of these developments. So, Sam, my first question to you is that recently we have seen the lower house elections in Japan, in which the opposition collapsed and LDP had a landslide victory. But what is the policy direction of the Takaichi's government, which you can see? Is it going beyond the truism, or we are not going to see much difference?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Arun, for the opportunity to be here today and for the invitation to come on the podcast. Um, Thanks for the great introduction. I think to start out, to talk about kind of the implications of the recent elections or the lower house elections in Japan, I think this is really a watershed moment for Japan. And not to, understate just the tectonic victory that Takaichi and her Liberal Democratic Party really had. And so this was the biggest win for her party since the end of World War II. So even bigger than what her predecessor. And Takaichi is known as kind of this protege. So her mentor actually was Abe Shinzo, who was the very consequential Japanese prime minister through most of the 2010s. He had formed a very close relationship with Modi, with President Trump, with various different leaders. And so after Prime Minister Abe resigned, mostly due to health issues in 2020, and then when he was assassinated in 2022, Japan kind of went in this very different policy direction. So first, his successor was this guy named Suga, and so he was the chief cabinet secretary of the Liberal Democratic Party and held a lot of institutional posts, but was kind of viewed as this kind of weak transitional figure as the Japanese LDP kind of figured out what they were doing. Then after Suga, there was Kishida, and he was widely considered to be this dove. So not as hawkish on China as Abe was, had less of a strategic vision, but he did do quite a few things, which I'll touch upon later. And particularly, one thing to highlight there was that Kishida actually promoted what's known as these three strategic documents at the end of 2022, towards the end of his prime ministership. The national security strategy, the national defense strategy, and the national defense buildup. And so Kishida was kind of this transitional figure, and then, but because of domestic political issues, most prominently the political fundraising scandal in which different LDP ministers and politicians were caught taking money that very much upset the public, and the LDP was kind of under his watch in this crisis. And so back during not this past upper house elections, but the previous one, Japan had actually, was in the minority, or it had a plurality in conjunction with some minority parties, but they had essentially become part of the minority, and that was unprecedented, except for two times, one in 2009 and one in the 1990s, where the Democratic Party of Japan took over. But I mean, historically, so Japan has had a really weak opposition, and the fact that the LDP under Kishida and then Ishiba's leadership was able to fall to such a low level really shocked not only observers of Japan, but really shocked people around the world. And so, after Ishiba was forced to resign, he did manage to negotiate the trade agreement with President Trump and negotiate the reciprocal tariff rates. Now the reciprocal tariff rates are no longer valid because of the Supreme Court decision. But now that Takichi has kind of come in and she has a lot of coattails, not only of Abe to ride, but also her own mandate to govern. And so I can't overstate really the importance of the election, not only, in the arc of Japanese strategic thinking, but also domestically, kind of now that she has the political capital to essentially do a lot of things that Abe wanted to do, but couldn't necessarily get past the finish line. We're in for a very interesting period in Japanese politics and also Japanese foreign policy writ large.
So, Japan has long been seen more as an economic powerhouse, especially, post Second World War, and but with a very restrained military posture. So, but in recent years, however, we have seen, debates on defense spending, constitutional reinterpretation, and greater strategic activism. So recently we saw also there was an incident that where Japan had detained the Chinese fishing vessel, though it was released, very quickly, but still, so and we have seen, the growing kind of strain between Japan and China also. So how do you see, especially under the new regime? So is Japan undergoing a fundamental shift in its national identity from a post-war pacifist state to a more conventional strategic path? And what are the, domestic and external forces driving this change?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Arun. So I think what's really interesting about kind of the direction that Japan is going in is that a lot of it is being driven at the kind of the top-down level by Japan's political leadership. And so if you look at a lot of public opinion polling, amongst the Japanese public, the majority of them actually favor remaining this, pacifist nation, not revising the Constitution. But then at the same time, you've seen growing support for, at least among the public, of potentially, more defense spending, revising Article 9 of the Constitution, which would allow Japan to deploy its military in offensive contexts. Um, and so it's been interesting to kind of follow, what the public thinks versus what the Japanese political leadership is doing. And so what I think is really kind of driving this shift, the increase in defense spending, talks about revision of Article 9, is that the strategic environment for Japan really has shifted quite significantly over the past decade, particularly, as the United States becomes a less reliable partner. And so, there's been conversations that have been had within kind of policy circles in Japan that, like, if Japan can no longer solely rely on the US to come to its defense, should it, revise the Constitution to basically have the capability to actually defend, not defend itself, but in a strategic context like Taiwan, actually go in and deploy defensive assets. But a lot of this is being driven at the leadership level. And so, a lot of the conversation, particularly around defense spending, predates the current regime or the current administration. And so some of it was being pushed by Abe, a lot of it was continued under Kishida, but then Japan is also being pushed by the US itself. So there's this conception of, like, can we really trust the US? Will they defend us? We have a, security treaty, but, there's an open question given, how fickle and crazy Trump has been. Kind of, can we rely on the US? And there's this other component where they're being pushed by the US to not increase more, spend more on defense, work with the US private sector to kind of create defense technologies. And so when Elbridge Colby, who's the Undersecretary of War for Policy under Trump, visited Japan last year, he kind of met with his Japanese counterparts and really shocked a lot of people when, he kind of pushed the Japanese to increase their defense spending even more than they already have. And so under the 2022 Kishida documents and that I mentioned earlier under Kishida, the Japanese have already committed to a massive increase in their defense spending. And so when Colby kind of came and was this messenger for Trump saying like you need to do even more, it was an even bigger wake up call for the Japanese. And now that Takaichi has won the election, now that she has this mandate, essentially what she's proposed is that she wants to, by the end of 2026, revise these three documents even further, and then commit to an even faster acceleration of defense spending than that was envisioned by her predecessor, Ishiba. And so what we're really, I think, kind of going to see as a result of all these both domestic and external forces is a Japan that it still retains onto its identity as a pacifist nation, but for strategic reasons, perhaps becoming this more conventional strategic power.
So, but no, as you rightly mentioned that, especially during Trump era, so there has been a lot of chatter in the geopolitical circles about China getting a larger space because
Yeah.
US, because of this issue of reliability of United States. So, in that context, if we look at basically China's rise vis-a-vis, the Japanese foreign policy or the Japanese national security policy. So China's rise, presents now Tokyo with a complex dilemma because there is deep economic interdependence on one hand, and there is a growing, strategic competition also on the other hand. If I wouldn't say competition, at least there are strategic threats to Japan. So how
Yeah.
is Japan attempting to balance this dual reality? So particularly because there are areas like supply chains, technology, and then there is maritime security also.
Yes. So it's a really excellent question. And it kind of touches really at the heart of kind of what Japanese policymakers are trying to plan for and really form a strategic identity around. And so, it's no secret that, the majority of the Japanese economy is built off of the back of trade with China, right? And so, um, about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, there's this recognition amongst a lot of Japanese policymakers that this, imbalance, the fact that Japan is so reliant on the Chinese economy, presents a strategic threat to Japanese interests, to Japanese national security. And so the Japanese have really been leaders in this promoting policies and this conception of economic security. And so diversifying supply chains, diversifying trade partners. And so what we've really seen, especially now that the Japan-China relationship has grown much more adversarial over the past, couple years, particularly recently, with Takaichi's recent comments about Taiwan and, the Chinese counter actions that were taken against Japan, is that, how can Japan um, reduce its reliance on China from an economic perspective? They already view them as a security threat. That much is clear in the three documents that I mentioned, in statements that have been made by Takaichi and others in the administration. And the way that they've been doing that is trying to rely much more on non-Western partners. And so they've been increasing trade and investment with India, for example, with Southeast Asian countries, with the Pacific Islands. And so they're really trying to manage this, strategic competition and the new security environment and the strategic environment that they find themselves in through these kind of economic security policies that they've, first conceptualized and then have adopted and then helped popularize, particularly in the US context. And so the US really wasn't on board or with a lot of these economic security policies, export controls on semiconductors, these kind of policies, until the Japanese really convinced them otherwise. And so yeah, Japan is managing the competition through that lens, and then also making strategic investments um, through tech. So building new semiconductor manufacturing facilities in Kumamoto Prefecture, for example, helping and working with international partners to develop new R&D for Japanese industry. And to touch on briefly on the maritime security aspect. So recently, the Japanese government, I think it was back in 2023, um, conceptualized this new idea of official security assistance. So this is kind of derived from the same idea as ODA, official development assistance. So rather than providing direct loans or, infrastructure, the Japanese government is like directly providing assistance to the militaries of nations like Malaysia, like Indonesia, and really building their capacity at the local level to help them deter threats from China in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and other flashpoints. And so, yeah, that's kind of in broad strokes how Tokyo is kind of dealing with China and trying to hedge its bets.
So, as we talked about, how, Tokyo is going to deal with China. So the issue of Taiwan also comes up. So,
Yeah.
how central is Taiwan in terms of the Japanese strategic and national security thinking?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really one that's been dominating the news cycles ever since Takaichi came out and made these or made the comments that she did about the potential Japanese defense of Taiwan. And so, if you go back to again, it's kind of being a dead horse here, but to the three documents that I mentioned, it was really the first time that Japan recognized China as the core strategic threat facing the country. And they did that in a very explicit manner. They mentioned Taiwan, I think a total of at least 9 times, possibly more. And so now that Takaichi is committed to revising these documents by the end of 2026, and the fact that she's also known as someone who's very hawkish on China, and someone who is very sympathetic towards the Taiwanese, I think Taiwan will become, if it isn't already, very central to Japanese strategic thinking, particularly you know in the current security environment that Tokyo finds itself. And so, if you think about it, like in the event of a cross-strait invasion, like there is Japan will be involved one way or another. Whether that's they actually like deploy, ships, they deploy troops, they deploy other assets, or if they simply allow the United States to deploy their strategic assets, like the military bases on Okinawa, the first island chain, like all of these different strategic and assets that are very close to the Taiwanese um, mainland. And so, you know, whether the Japanese like it or not, they're going to be involved and be a really key stakeholder um, if such a contingency occurs. I tend to be more on the optimistic side that there's all these analysts in Washington that say by 2028, by 2029, by 2020, by 2030, China's going to invade. I don't necessarily fall into that camp, but what I do think is that it is kind of the security threat at the current moment in time that is, top of mind for the U.S. and by extension, because of the Japanese assets that are involved, top of mind for the Japanese. And so what a lot of people don't actually, remember about Taiwan is that it was actually a Japanese colony, before the war, and the relationship between Japan and Taiwan is actually very strong. I remember when I went to Taipei and I was invited by the Taiwanese government, um, they took us to the presidential palace, and the presidential palace actually used to be the former mansion or residence of the Japanese colonial governor when the Japanese actually controlled Taiwan. And so, not even just thinking about the strategic aspects of why Taiwan is important for Japan, but also from the cultural, the people to people element as well, like the historical legacy of Japanese involvement in Taiwan and the very warm relationship that exists today, I think is an important factor into kind of how Japan views Taiwan.
So no, let's talk a little bit because Japan is an economic powerhouse also. So let's talk a little bit about, the Japanese economy and business environment, particularly, relates to when relates to, investments in South Asia and especially India, because India, we've been talking about, Japan-China relationship. So
Yeah.
India is seen in South Asia as a counterweight to China. So that's one of the perceptions. So, if we look at it from the Japanese perspective, so where do the Japanese companies see advantages, in terms of dealing with India, larger South Asia also, but more specifically India, because we have seen, especially under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, so India has have a more proactive, foreign policy, and India has become much closer to Japan than it earlier was. So, no areas like auto sector. So Japan has been a dominant force even in Indian market also. And unlike the Chinese companies, Indians are not averse to buying Japanese products. So, so how do you see this trade and economy? Because nowadays, as the common dictum is that it is the economics which governs the politics and not the other way around. So, how do you see this relationship between India and Japan? And is it going to grow further, especially under the current government? Is it going to, impact the Japan-China relationship also? But how it will have a larger implication in the South Asian region?
No, it's a great question, Arun. And so thinking about kind of the Japan-India relationship particularly, so India is, I mean, sorry, Japan is currently, I believe, the third largest foreign investor in India, which is very significant in and of itself, through the Japan Bank of International Cooperation, through JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, and particularly in the National Capital Region of India and around kind of the Delhi, around Delhi. You've really seen a lot of high-profile infrastructure projects and Japanese money being used to build roads, bridges, and then one infrastructure project in particular that has kind of been a flagship symbol for the relationship has been this bullet train corridor between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. So using Japanese technology to improve public transit in India. And so it very much aligns from the Japanese perspective with increasing or diversifying its investment flows away from China. India, for a variety of reasons, is a really fantastic market for Japan because I mean, the labor force is very, affordable, and so Japanese companies can afford to come in, build manufacturing facilities, and then export their products not only to Japan but then also the United States as well. Kind of this concept of friendshoring and moving, the supply chains of a lot of Japanese companies outside or away from China and into places like India or in some cases like Vietnam, Malaysia, etc. And so I believe it was at or last year that Japan committed to increasing its investment in India from around, I believe the number was like 2.5 billion US dollars in 2024 to by 2030, 68 billion. And so there's going to be at least in my approximation, there will be a really big influx of Japanese companies coming in to the Indian economy over the next 5 years to kind of build on the commitments that were already made at the national level. Um, and also just as a recognition that India is a very close and strategic partner that Japan wants to build a closer relationship um, with. And then the other thing that I think is driving is closer cooperation between Japan and India and then South Asia writ large is this, as you kind of alluded to, is this strategic counterbalance against China, this prevailing narrative, right, that through institutions like the Quad or other multilateral partnerships, that the two countries, in conjunction with other middle powers, perhaps like Korea, Australia, Singapore, etc., can kind of challenge Chinese supremacy in the region. Whether they'll succeed or not is kind of an open question. But speaking kind of at a sector specific viewpoint. So I mean, you alluded to it a bit, but obviously, so like automobiles is a huge market for the Japanese, and so because of the recent tariffs that were actually imposed on Japanese automobiles, not even talking about the reciprocal tariffs, but the specific tariffs under, I think it was 301 or 232 authority in the US. And it's become a lot more expensive for Japanese companies like Toyota, Nissan, Honda, etc., to export a lot of their cars to the US market. And so India is becoming increasingly attractive for a lot of Japanese auto companies because there's a growing middle class, population demographic trends. India already has the largest population in the world, exceeding China. And so there's really lots of opportunities. I mean, they've already penetrated the market quite significantly. So, I mean, I was just in Delhi last month, and everywhere you go, there's a Suzuki or a Toyota or a Japanese automobile. But really, kind of building on that strategic advantage for the Japanese auto sector, I think will be something that we're likely to see. And then also in kind of like high technology areas. So, building out capabilities for artificial intelligence, for semiconductor manufacturing, and also like petrochemicals, which is historically been a strength of Gujarat state, and some of these a lot of strategic synergies for the Japanese business community in India for some of the reasons I outlined, but also from the strategic standpoint of we need to be doing more business with non-China aligned partners, and India, given its relationship with China, kind of presents the perfect um, case.
So thank you, Sam, for taking all of us through this, complex kind of a basically matrix. And because, in this part of the world, we generally tend to focus more on US and, sometimes Europe and maybe sometimes West Asia. But ironically, countries like Japan, which are an important partner for India, so and which have a major role to play in South Asia, which have played a major role in South Asia. So we don't tend to discuss much about it. I think probably one of the key reasons is also the language issue, because
Yeah.
the Japanese basically, what is happening in Japan, and it doesn't also much come out through the English language press. So, but thank you so much for taking out time from your busy schedule and sharing all these deep insights. We hope to host you back on the show soon again. And thank you, viewers, for watching. And we'll be back soon with another conversation, another show. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Arun.